Have you ever wondered how news agencies are informed on breaking news stories? Or how multiple journalists can be seeded a story at the same time, but the original source decides to go with one media outlet and not the other? I sat down with Bryan Bender, a former Politico award-winning national security reporter and editor, turned strategic communications advisor, to discuss the process of news dissemination and how he was seeded the 2017 New York Times breaking UAP news story, along with a few other journalists. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious today. As a publicist and also somebody who works with a media outlet, the Debrief, obviously, it's a very interesting relationship between publicists and media members. And I really wanted to find somebody who knew more about the UAP topic, but also was a really respected journalist in their space. And for yourself, it was working at Politico. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
Looking forward to it.
First off, I would love to ask you how you got into journalism and why.
Wow. Well, this goes back a while. I mean, I was one of the lucky, I guess, who kind of always knew what I wanted to do.
Right.
Ever since I was maybe in middle school. It was a couple things. One, it's kind of cliche to say this, but I saw the movie All the President's Men. With Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, the story of Watergate, and these two Washington Post reporters who broke that story, or broke a series of stories that led to the resignation, the only resignation of a sitting president. There was also a show very popular back then. It aired in reruns, The Brady Bunch. A lot of listeners probably remember that. There was an episode where the middle brother, and for a time, I was the middle brother, was getting picked on in school. And his dad said, hey, you should have an extracurricular activity. He decided to write for the school newspaper. And then the whole episode is about how he used the newspaper to like out all his enemies and get revenge for all the teachers he didn't like and the kids who were picking on him. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's a pretty powerful perch. That could be interesting. So it was a couple things. And then I had some teachers that in high school that were very instrumental, including one in particular who I'm still in touch with and consider a friend, who taught a journalism elective at a public high school in Pennsylvania where I grew up. And I think that's where I really got the bug, because that's where I actually started to become, quote unquote, a journalist. And what always attracted me about journalism too, and I've thought about this a lot lately, is it's one of the few professions that you don't need to really go to school for it. You don't need a certification. You don't need a special degree. I mean, it's great to go to college and journalism school and all that stuff. But if you can read and write and distill information in a way that is accessible to people, I always tell young kids who want advice, like, stop thinking about going to journalism school. Just be a journalist. Start doing it. See if you like it. See if you're good at it. Write for the little local paper for free, on your day off. And so the only thing I'll add is, just for readers, is I'm not really a journalist anymore. Surprisingly, I'm sort of a recovering journalist, but just the last few months, I decided that I'm going to still write, but not as a sort of daily ink-stained wretch that I was for almost 30 years. And so that's kind of new and exciting for me, but I think I know a little bit about journalism.
Yeah. No, well, I think you know a lot about journalism. Are you going to stay on the national security beat, or are you going to move or evolve?
Well, what I'm doing now is actually advising companies, nonprofits, research universities, mostly in the tech space, but a lot of it, not surprisingly, is national security focused. It's defense, some in the space exploration, space economy world. It's kind of a range of things. But yeah, I absolutely, I mean, one of the reasons why, this was sort of a good fit for me is that a lot of the companies, universities that I'm advising are focused on national security. So most definitely.
Yeah, it makes sense. I remember we spoke about a couple months ago. You told me that 9/11, and unfortunately 9/11 was a big break in your career. Can you explain, why that was and what happened then to reporting in media after 9/11?
Well, I sort of fell into covering national security. I didn't come from a military family. I mean, my grandfather served in World War II, but that didn't make me any different than anybody else of my generation. But when I got out of college, and I had a good bit of experience already as a journalist, internships, writing for my college newspaper, I just sort of fell into covering the Pentagon. And this was in the mid 90s during the so-called peace dividend, where, you know, the American economy, the global economy was booming. We didn't have a lot of threats on the horizon. There obviously were bad actors in the world and conflicts that were going on, but America really was pretty much at peace. We were friends with Russia. We were developing a sort of wary but mutually beneficial economic relationship with China. And I was sort of covering the military and how the military was trying to adapt to that world where you didn't have a big potential adversary out there. There was the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, which was something that I covered in the 90s. And that was sort of really kind of the biggest story, quite frankly. And so I spent a lot of time learning about how the military worked, how it developed new weapon systems, how military budgets worked, how Congress played its oversight role on the Department of Defense. And so when 9/11 happened, and I was covering the Pentagon at the time, I always sort of felt a little guilty about it. But the truth is, a lot of the mainstream media was like, oh my God, we need people who know the military now because there's this big war that's going to happen. Or that, this was when the US sent troops to Afghanistan, not much later invaded Iraq. All, for generally the same ideological reasons. Well, we have to fight the Muslim extremists, but we also have to sort of build a world in the Middle East somehow is more democratic. Therefore, you might have a situation where there's not as many threats emanating from that. So, it was sort of career-wise, it was a good place to be somebody who actually knew the military, had spent some time with it when 9/11 happened. And so, much of the next really decade was spent focusing on the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, the counterinsurgencies there, and quite frankly, the disasters that both of those conflicts kind of turned out to be. A lot of hubris, a lot of overreaching, a lot of looking to the military to solve problems that, by definition, really weren't very well suited to the military to solve.
How has reporting changed then? Since then, I would imagine it has. And how has the media landscape changed since 9/11 and how they report and how you even report talking about the Pentagon?
Well, it's changed a lot. I've been teaching a little bit on and off the last few years, journalism students at Arizona State University. And we talk about this a lot. But, when I came up the ranks in the mid 90s, I hate to say it because I'm aging myself, but there really wasn't an internet. I mean, the internet really didn't exist. It was a thing, but it was just beginning to develop and evolve. And I remember when I was in college, I got my first email address, but to go check my email, I had to go to some building, to a computer lab, and log on and check my email every couple of days or every week or two. That was the early 90s. And so by the time I started in journalism, mid to late 90s, it was starting to change, but it really was very similar to the old model. And I think it's changed a lot. I think it's changed in some ways for the better because the price of entry into journalism, if you will, is a lot lower now. The barriers are a lot lower. I mean, you don't have to get a job at a big name or even small name newspaper or TV station or magazine. you can become a citizen journalist, because of the internet, because of the ability to spread electrons all over the world within seconds. We used to call them bloggers. Now I don't know what they're called, influencers, or just, podcasters like you. I mean, there's so many different ways to be a journalist today than there were when I first started. I think, but like everything, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think as much as people want to attack the mainstream media, the truth is the journalism that I started out in was a real profession where there were rules, there were guidelines, there were people looking over your shoulder, lots of editors questioning whether the story was correct, whether the facts were right, whether the sources were credible. That still exists, but I think because it's just become so decentralized, there's a lot of information out there that, quite frankly, doesn't get scrubbed very well. And so I think even though the sort of the globalization of journalism is a good thing, I think it puts the onus much more on the news consumer to know what they're reading. You can't just trust that what I read is correct. Now, you couldn't necessarily always do that with the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Boston Globe, where I worked for many years. But at least you had a sense that there's a process there. There's an infrastructure that before you pick up the paper, this thing you're reading went through a whole series of revisions, edits, and I think that's less and less the case now if you just go online, whether it's social media or somewhere else, to get your quote unquote information. It's why my best advice to people when they ask me, like, who do you read? What publications? Where do you go to get your news? I say, forget about publications. Follow journalists. Get to know journalists. Get to know their track record. It almost doesn't matter who they write for or who they broadcast for. Be discerning and do your homework. And if you find someone who checks out and generally is right and accurate and informative, follow that person. Don't worry so much about whether it's this newspaper or that broadcast outlet. I think there's some really good journalists and they're kind of all over the place. And there's some really bad journalists and they're all over the place too. And so it's harder. It takes more energy, more effort, I think, to sort of know, what am I reading? Do I believe it? Should I believe it? And then what else should I be reading as well to get different perspectives?
Yeah, I agree. And this whole relationship too, and I'm glad you brought that up because there is this relationship obviously with the reporter and their outlet and the concept now of, people not fact checking or this concept of even fake news. I hate using that word. It's such a political word now too in its own way. But looking at even the relationship between a publicist or a PR person, you've had many different relationships, I would imagine, in your workspace with publicists or PR people, especially people that are spokespeople like Susan Goff from the Pentagon. Looking at the relationship, let's just say with the Pentagon in general, how has their politics or the way that they go about doing their publicity or PR as a spokesperson, for example, like Susan Goff, how has that positively or affected your career going forward? Maybe not your entire career, but your reporting career, I would say, and how you do your job.
Well, I mean, I've certainly spent a lot of time over the years dealing with PR people or, media relations professionals, both in the government and then, of course, in the private sector, who work for corporations or in academia. And, some lessons I guess I've learned over the years are a couple. One, you have to, as a journalist, you have to be aware that whenever you're talking really to anyone, and maybe even more so to a public affairs officer, let's say in this case, for the Pentagon, that, everyone has an agenda. Everyone has a story they want to tell, or a story that they want to accentuate and sort of, maybe, if not bury, sort of smooth over other aspects of the story that they don't want you to hear. So you have to be very hyper aware that nobody's telling you anything just to be informative. I mean, yes, they're trying to be informative, but to an end. I mean, they have a mission. And I think the other lesson I've learned is that the best public affairs officers or the best spokespeople, in my experience, are the ones that whatever organization they work for, whether it's a private company or a government agency, are in the room when decisions are made. In other words, they are seen by their boss as part of the leadership team. They're not just the person, 5 offices down the hallway who writes the press release at the tail end of the decision-making process. If it's a press person whose job is to just write the press release after all the meetings have happened, all the decisions have been made, and the powers that be decide, here's what we want to put out there, they're not going to be a very effective spokesperson. I think, and you got to do some homework on that, but the ones that I've always found the most useful are the ones whose bosses actually value them in the decision-making process on the front end. So they're considered a real advisor, not just, this bureaucrat who at the end has to, make some copies and, write up a few paragraphs. What else have I learned about? I mean, you mentioned Susan Goff. She is, I think, to understand her, and I don't know her personally, I don't know her that well. I've certainly interacted with her a lot over the years. I've always found her to be helpful where she can be. But with a big asterisk next to that, which is, and this is another lesson, spokespeople are only as informative from a journalist, or only as useful from a journalist perspective, to the extent they actually know things. And if their bosses don't tell them everything, they're sort of limited in what they can say and what they can share and, what they even know. And I don't have a good sense of where Susan fits in that construct. In other words, she's the public mouthpiece, if you will, for Arrow, this now, the all domain anomaly resolution office at the Pentagon, which is overseeing the UAP issue. I don't get a sense one way or the other whether she's considered an insider in that operation, or she's just kind of brought in and briefed on certain things when it's time to bring in the public affairs people because there's some public announcement or a hearing is coming or something like that. So I don't really have a good sense of that. But in my dealings with her, I've always found her to be as helpful as I think she can be, given whatever I'm asking or the information I'm searching for. But again, I think it's important for people to understand that everyone wants to look at the Pentagon as a monolith. The Pentagon is hiding something. The Pentagon knows this, but they won't tell us. That's certainly true in a lot of areas, but depending on the case that you're dealing with or the story that you're trying to report out, a lot really depends on who knows what and who's sharing what. Because, just because she's the official spokesperson for the Department of Defense on this issue, by no means that she actually knows everything. In fact, she probably doesn't. In fact, I'm almost sure she doesn't. And so I think you have to understand that to understand the limitations that someone like her might be under. And it also explains, I think, why she gets so much flack all the time. I mean, people are like, why doesn't she know this? Or why won't she say this? Or why did she say this before? And then she said this later. I mean, it may also be a function of she knew a certain amount then, and she knows a little bit more now. And so, I think, that's just something I throw out there because I think one of the things I think that helped me cover this issue a little bit was sort of knowing a little bit about how the bureaucracy works and doesn't work. And so I think it helped give me a lens a little bit and a sort of almost like a BS meter that maybe I wouldn't have had if I was just a general assignment reporter and somebody said, hey, go cover the Pentagon's UFO effort. Now, some could look at that and say, well, Bender's just been in it too long. He knows these people. He has relationships with them professionally and in some cases personally. So, he's just drinking the Kool-Aid and buying whatever they say. I think if people looked at my career and all of the work I've done at the Boston Globe, at Politico, at other publications, I don't think anyone would say I was writing press releases for the military-industrial complex. In fact, the opposite. I've asked a lot of questions, made a lot of enemies, but I'd like to think my record speaks for itself. on this issue, but also others too. And, I had an editor who once said, "You're only as good as your last story." And I think that's really true. I mean, we all screw up. We all get played. We all get things wrong. It's about getting back up and going back at it and getting it right the next time, or getting more of the story next time than maybe you had the first time.
I think that's so important. I think everything you said there is so valid, from, Susan Goff and don't shoot the messenger, the communications person, because you only know so much, all the way down to the journalists that can make mistakes and will learn from them and grow. I think it's so important in both ways because we're human.
You mentioned fake.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you mentioned real quick, you mentioned fake news. And, obviously for any of us who've spent our professional lives in this business, that's very much a loaded word. And sure. I think it's totally misunderstood. I mean, to me, fake news is someone, for propaganda purposes, who sets out from go to publish misinformation, to publish things that are not true, or maybe are half true, but are presented in a way, put out there in a way that is, like I said, from the get-go, pushing a particular point of view or agenda. It is factually bankrupt. That, to me, is fake news. Now, the term fake news has been applied to all kinds of media outlets, from the New York Times to Politico to, it's sort of become a moniker for the lefty media that is pushing fake news. It's not what, major media organizations do. It doesn't mean they don't get things wrong. And as soon as they get something wrong, that's when the people pounce and they say, "Look, fake news." But that's different than making it up from the beginning, right? I mean, for sure. If you're in the course of reporting, trying to get to the truth, and you get bamboozled by a source, or you're human, you make a mistake, people see that, pull that out and say, "Oh, look, fake news." That's very different from somebody who's literally, their job is to get up there and throw bullshit out there on purpose every day to basically mislead. And so, when I hear fake news, I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? Because to me, I think most people just don't understand the difference. And there's a real difference.
You literally just segued into my next question too, about getting ahead of the story. So we look at the Pentagon, for example, and I don't even know if this is legal or not. As a communications person that doesn't work within government, I'm more on the lifestyle, business, entertainment, and philanthropy side of things. But we have similar mechanisms in PR. We do very similar things, even when it comes to working with spokespeople or being spokespeople. But getting ahead of the story, do we have someone like Susan Goff or anybody else within the Pentagon that they know that something's going to happen, or they know that a media outlet's going to report something negative? Is it legal for them to be able to get ahead of that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between, like you mentioned, but under US law, in this case, the Pentagon can't purposely spread misinformation. That would be illegal. I mean, that's psychological operations, which are designated to be done in a war zone. And even that sometimes raises ethical and legal questions about, I remember covering it during the Iraq War. The Pentagon hired a contractor that actually planted stories in the Iraqi media. And the intent was to, shape public opinion in Iraq when US troops were occupying the country. And that raised a lot of questions, like, did that cross the line? So there's clearly this no-go zone where you can't get ahead of a story by putting out misinformation to try and somehow blunt whatever might be coming, or you think might be coming out. And then, of course, I think what you're talking about is, in the case of UAPs, there's a forthcoming intelligence community report that was coming. It was supposed to be coming out. It came out in January of 2023. And there was some coverage before that where I don't know this for sure because I wasn't in the room, but I got the impression that somebody at DOD, in consultation with others in the national security bureaucracy, decided that, maybe we need to get out in front of this a little bit. And by that, maybe make available some experts, some government officials, give them a briefing on what we're talking about, what we're working on this topic of UAPs. You mentioned the New York Times piece. I don't know exactly who Julian's sources were on that, but it it rang to me as, he probably, like a lot of us, have been requesting an interview with Arrow or a sit down, and they decided, well, let's let the New York Times cover this and give them a sort of a jump. That happens all the time. And that's, we don't necessarily like that when we say, oh, you're picking favorites. But I think to kind of make up for it, a couple of weeks later, the Pentagon did do a briefing, also ahead of the release of this public report, with the senior intelligence official at the Pentagon and the head of Arrow. And that was on the record. I was there along with a pretty diverse group of journalists that they invited. It was invite only, but I don't think they left too many, credible, known news organizations out of that. And so I think that was an example of getting ahead. Sort of, there's going to be a bunch of interest in this report when it comes out. Let's kind of almost seed the ground a little bit first. And I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. I mean, I think the government does that all the time. Companies do that all the time if they have, something that's going to be coming out, particularly when it's negative or it's not really something they consider to be a great story, that it's going to probably lead to some negative coverage. I would advise them, well, maybe you want to bring in a couple of reporters first, off the record or on background, and sort of educate them on your side of it and why you think it's not so bad. Doesn't always work.
Though? But why? I find it so interesting of why they would do that, though, because it wasn't really negative. It was just kind of the same report as last time with just a little bit more UAPs and balloon action.
Yeah, I mean,
balloonish entities or things like that they were saying in the report. So why would you want to get ahead of it if you don't have a negative story there? Are you tempering the media then, or tempering the public?
When I say negative, I mean necessarily, I don't mean that it has to be something that's like makes you look bad.
Right.
That's negative. That's a category of negative. I say negative more broadly in the sense that, like, if you're, let's, theorize or be hypothetical for a minute. If you're Arrow or your other senior government officials and you're worried that too much of the media coverage when this report comes out is going to be about UFOs from other planets and, is the US government finally taking another step towards telling us what they know? If you're worried that that's going to be the narrative, it's not hard to have the New York Times have a front page story that says the Pentagon studied all these things and primarily they think they're foreign drones. It's sort of, it almost immediately sets a narrative that other narrative now has to fight against, right? And again, I'm not saying I know that this is what they were thinking. I don't know what was in their minds. And Julia, by the way, I know, and I should say this just for full disclosure, I know quite well. I've known him for a long time. I wouldn't say we're best friends, but we're friendly. We've traveled together professionally. I know his work. I think he's a very good reporter. And so, I just want to make that clear. If I were him and Arrow said, hey, Bender, come on in, we'll give you a backgrounder on what we're up to, I would have probably gone there and written a very similar story. Although, I don't know, I'd like to think that I would have maybe asked a few more questions than at least it appeared from that story. Because let's face it, whether you think the majority of these sightings are foreign drones or not, I think it's irrefutable now that there are cases, credible cases that the US military has been tracking that do not fit into that category. Most of them may very well be, and probably are, drones of some sort, foreign, domestic, private, recreational, balloons, all this earthly stuff that we've been hearing about. I think most people think, yeah, of course, a lot of that clutter up there that people might see and mistake for something is probably explainable. But there is clearly a category that isn't. And some people might criticize me for focusing more on that category, but to me, it's more interesting. It's more newsworthy. I mean, yes, it's newsworthy if China's flying balloons every few months over the US and we didn't know it, or we didn't, and so I'm extremely interested in learning more about that. I mean, what were these things? How many more are there? Or how many more are we finding? What are the explanations, et cetera, et cetera. But, I also think it's good journalism to be asking the questions about that other category. because it's not just us that are you're talking about it. I mean, it's Navy pilots, it's other military personnel, current and former, and most importantly, perhaps, senior members of Congress who are the people's representatives who are saying, in law, we want to know more. And yes, they want to know more about drones. Of course they do. But they also want to know more about this other category too. All you have to do is read the law that they passed in December. It's very clearly, at least partially, about this none of the above category that may not be the majority. It's probably not. It's probably a pretty slim minority of the cases that at least we know of or have been reported. But one last thing I'll say on sort of the Pentagon, maybe working with the New York Times to get a story out ahead of that UAP report. I think there's some journalists, like human beings writ large, who tend to be curious about that unknown category more than others. And, I said the Pentagon's not a monolith. Journalism isn't a monolith either. I mean, we're all people. We all have different backgrounds and upbringings and points of view and religious backgrounds. And so the idea that that's never going to color what we write and we're just going to be just the facts man and stick down the middle of the road is sort of, I think, a little bit of a fantasy. I mean, I always tell my journalism students, there is such a thing as objective journalism. And it's objective facts. It's finding the objective fact. And that's not always very easy, especially now in a day where we live now, where even the experts can't agree often on what the facts are. But there are such things as objective facts. And being an objective journalist doesn't mean that you check all your biases at the door. I mean, that would be impossible. You have to be aware of what your biases are. And you have to really try and keep them out of your journalism. But in the end, objective journalism isn't giving this side 50% say and this side 50% say. That's lazy. You got to do some homework and figure out who's more truthful than the other, because at some point, somebody's going to be standing on a more solid bedrock of facts than the other. And I hate this journalism. It passes as journalism where it's like, well, as long as you get everybody's say in it, it's fair. Yeah, you have to get everybody's say, but you also have to figure out who's full of shit and who isn't. And again, it's not easy to do. I'm not saying you can do that very easily, but I think that's the job of a journalist, is to try and figure out, well, who's snowing me and who isn't. And maybe it's, a little bit of both on both sides, but, you got to figure that out. And I think in the case of UAPs, the same goes, which is trying to stick to the facts. What do we know? What can we credibly prove? And as you might imagine, and maybe we'll lead to your other questions, this is one of the most difficult topics to do that with, for obvious reasons.
Almost impossible at times. And I always wonder why we're all in this. but it is fun at its own,
some of us, unlike some people in this, I genuinely fell in it, and here I am. But I wasn't looking for this topic as a beat. But I think anybody who's come to it, however they've come to it, once you're there, it's like a car crash. You can't look away, right? You can't just be like, well, I'm moving on.
Well, and there's so much to it. It's just so there's so much, from science to entertainment to philosophy to history to you name it. And it has everything. It has everything you would want in an academic study.
And if you're curious on any level, there's that nagging, what is it? What's the answer? The answer or the answers? Because I'm sure there's more than one. It can't just be one.
I honestly think that if we ever do find out, it'll be something that we never imagined ever. I do, though, want to go back to the conversation about this balloons and Biden shooting down balloons and what happened in the media, because I've never seen that before as a publicist. I felt that there was a knee-jerk press conference that happened from the White House and also from the Pentagon. And then it consistently kept going with no answers getting media together to report and talk about this from around the world. And in the end, we find out that there obviously are Chinese balloons, spy balloons. And then we see that there's, I believe it's 3 other objects that have been shot down, and now they will not be, the material will not be retrieved. Now, have you ever seen anything like that in press? And also, would you consider this posturing?
Well, I mean, obviously, I've been paying a lot of attention to the coverage and also the attempts to get more information out of the Biden administration about what were these, were they foreign, were they domestic, were they just these innocuous things floating up there that we got trigger happy about? I have talked to some people who are on the inside, and I do get a very strong sense that one thing we're learning, and I know this is going to be disappointing to a lot of people out there who are fierce believers that there's this mountain of information and secrets that they just won't show us, they won't tell us. But I think for a long, long, long time, maybe forever really, the Department of Defense, the military, let's start there. We'll talk about the CIA, the intelligence communities later. But I don't think the military has really had much of a focus at all on identifying things up there that aren't immediately considered a massive national security threat. And by that, I mean, if you're the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, the US-Canadian command set up during the Cold War to scan the skies over North America, your job has always been to pick up that intercontinental ballistic missile, packing a 50 megaton nuclear warhead on it, coming over the poles, or the Russian bombers, invading airspace over Alaska. You're not really tasked with looking for the needle in the haystack that's not considered a military threat. And somebody was pointing this out to me recently. If you go on any of these apps, you can see the commercial airliners flying over North America at any given moment, actually all over the world, really. And when you look at it, you're like, wow, they look like they're going to crash into each other. There's literally thousands of them up there at any given time. Take that number and double it to account for the drones that are aloft at any given time, none of which ever file a flight plan, or in most cases they don't. So nobody even really knows they're up there. And if they do know, it's a very localized no. In other words, you're a drone that's, scouting the border, or you're scouting farmland for agricultural purposes or whatever. Maybe your local municipal airport knows you're up there, but NORAD doesn't know you're up there because it's not really their job to track you. And so I think what we saw with the balloons, whatever you believe they were or weren't, I think there was sort of this 5-alarm fire where this Chinese balloon was spotted. And it's not clear to me whether NORAD spotted it or people in Montana were like, what the hell is that? I don't know which came first, but they were able to clearly track it back and, determine that its origins were in China. But I think when that happened, and America did what it does best these days, which is launch a circular firing line of political accusations about who missed it, whose job was it. It became a hyper partisan issue immediately. The president probably felt that he was being accused of somehow being asleep at the switch. And then we heard that, there were some under the Trump years. And then it was not clear whether anybody was told about it or they learned about it after the fact. But I think they were hypersensitive to being caught with their pants down again. So you can imagine NORAD being told, you can't miss anything now. And now NORAD has to look for the needles in a haystack when it's not really what their job is day to day. Their job is to protect the nation from Armageddon. And so now they're trying to pick out, what do we know is up there? What do we not know? And they find 3 things that probably, don't belong here. What those things were, we've heard reports about them being innocuous research balloons, or the Boy Scouts set up a project a couple of years ago, and then it's been floating around ever since. We don't really know, but my sense is that they were a little trigger happy. And it was more about politics than it was about national security. It was like, we cannot be caught again like we were with the Chinese balloon. Now, why they won't release the information about these things, it's a really good question. I'm a little surprised. I'll be honest with you. I thought they'd be a little bit more forthcoming. And Politico, one of my former colleagues at Politico, Aaron Benko, I thought had a good story this week about how even Congress isn't getting very many answers. And maybe it's because they don't have a lot of answers, but they must know what they shot down, I would think, at least have some idea. And if it was foreign drones, that's a huge story. You know, 4 of them in a week, basically violating American or Canadian airspace.
Petrifying.
And if that's true, I mean, that would explain maybe why they don't want to talk about it just yet.
For sure. I find it so interesting, though, that we have, January, we get, it's passed into legislation, and they have the defense bill that has this whole UAP section where it talks about, what will happen when, whistleblowers can come forward. They have 72 hours to report to Congress, and then later on the president would know. So there's this whole guide that they would go by into reporting anything that's UAP related activity. They also then have words from like crash retrievals, which is very interesting, and reverse engineering. These are very strong words. We also use them a lot in other things that are not related to UAP. So we should, let people know that when people in the intelligence community, for example, do use things that are reverse engineering, it could be for just a strategy, that could be from a foreign adversary, or technology, right? It doesn't have to be UAP related. But I do say that it's very interesting it's in that section, but also it's interesting that now since January, we have this wording that goes into legislation, into the defense bill, but then right after we have these shot down objects with potentially a crash retrieval conversation. And the media, along with then the US government, is using the same vernacular that we use within the UAP topic. Is that just a coincidence? I know this might seem heavy conspiracy, but it's very interesting to me how that ended up. When I'm watching the timeline, I'm like, this is insane. I've never seen this before ever in my life, or have even read about it. So I was curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
There's no doubt that I think the legislation that you're talking about, what's in it, what it requires the executive branch to do, some of it public, but a lot of it not public, behind closed doors, reporting to Congress, is definitely unprecedented. I think the shoot down of the Chinese balloon and the other 3, to be determined objects, also unprecedented. But I think to me, it underscores how when you talk about UAP, it's like a ball of yarn. You have to first separate out at least a couple, probably more than a couple of different things that have kind of been muddled together. We talked a lot about drones. We live in an era, the first era in the history of the world, where you and me can go order an airplane on Amazon, effectively an airplane, small, but high tech, and go fly it. I mean, so I think you have to understand that that's the day in which we live. And if you're the military, and unidentified aerial phenomena is your job, a huge part of it is getting your hands around the drone issue. Look at the war in Ukraine. Just this week, the Pentagon is begging Congress for more money for counter-drone technology, because drones are being used not just to target missiles, but to literally drop bombs onto Russian tanks, and vice versa. The Russians can't get enough of these Iranian drones because it's become a big edge, if you will, on the battlefield. So again, you have to understand that we live in a world where that's happening in a big way, really for the first time. Yeah, I mean, drones have been around for decades, but now they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere for military purposes, recreational purposes, economic purposes. I mean, they use it. Insurance companies use drones now to figure out where your land begins and my land ends. It's almost never ending. And so that's one piece of the yarn you got to pull off this bigger subject. Then, of course, there is the competition with China and Russia. And, could they be developing drones? We know they have been in a big way to spy on us. I think it's The Drive has done some really good reporting on some Chinese efforts to survey the US through some more modern high-tech drones. So you have that, the sort of national security threat component here in the US or over North America, potentially, let alone where our military forces are around the world, where the Chinese or others could spy on them. Then you have, a bunch of pilots who came forward and said, we saw these things that don't seem to be drones at all. They did these things that, at least from our perspective, defy aerodynamics as we even know it. So who could have built that thing? And then, of course, the question arises, well, maybe the Chinese did. Maybe it's a foreign adversary that had a breakthrough. Maybe it's ours, a secret stealth program that nobody wants to talk about yet. And they're testing it. I mean, we built the stealth fighter, we built the stealth bomber, we built lots of classified drones over the years. And obviously, we didn't just build them and send them off to war. We flew them for years. We tested them for years. So it's logical that some of these sightings of things that don't really seem like they fit easily into a conventional box could be something that we're developing in secret and we don't want to talk about. The Pentagon publicly has said that's not the case. But the Pentagon speaks for the Pentagon. It doesn't speak for the CIA. People forget the U-2 spy plane was originally flown by the CIA. It was a CIA spy plane. It wasn't a military spy plane. And that's a world that I know less about. And it's partially because even as a national security reporter, it's much more opaque what the spy agencies like the CIA are doing and what they might know. And so all these pieces of yarn are all wrapped up in this topic. And they get sort of kludged together. And I think a lot of the coverage also kludges them together. And so it's hard to know sometimes which piece of this UAP topic we're talking about, because the definition that the Pentagon uses is quite broad. It includes all the stuff I'm talking about potentially. And I think, but I do think I'll end this by saying, going back to the legislation that you mentioned, I think Congress is really focused on the advanced technology aspect of this. Obviously, they're concerned if it's just a mundane drone and the Chinese are flying it over our, or a balloon and flying it over our sensitive facilities. But if you read the language, they want to know, are there secret programs, foreign or domestic? Are there things that crashed that we might have learned things from and, wiled away somewhere in a secret hangar somewhere? I mean, they really want to get at the idea of, is there an advanced technology that we don't know about that somebody here on Earth has developed, or big question mark, somebody else has? And that's where the whistleblower protection provision comes in that you mentioned, which is, if you're in the government or you were in the government and you know something, come tell us. And we promise not to throw you in jail for it. And so that to me is going to be the most interesting piece of this, perhaps, which is, I don't know how much we, the public, will get to know about that, but who does come forward? What do they have to say? And also, quite frankly, how many are credible and how many are kooks? And that's another thing that I talk about a lot, which is people assume just because you worked at the CIA or NASA or the Pentagon and you have a great story that you know what the hell you're talking about. I mean, these are hundreds of thousands of people that have worked in these agencies, and they're human beings too. And I always ask people who have some fantastical testimony about, I heard this or I heard that. Well, who did you hear it from? Did you see it with your own eyes? Were you briefed on it in a SCIF, a secret compartmentalized information facility? How do you know this? Because you and I could have a beer and talk about a lot of things we heard, but it doesn't mean they're true, right? And I'll be interested to see how challenging it will be for this whistleblower thing to weed out the BS, because, who knows? I mean, people could come forward claiming a lot of things that they heard about, but it doesn't mean that they actually exist.
100%.
And then the reverse engineering stuff is obviously very interesting too. I mean, is there, as Congress has mandated, go find us whether there's these deep, dark, compartmentalized programs, which very few people were aware of, that might have had some material that they couldn't explain and they were trying to figure out, reverse engineer. But you're right. We have to be careful when we say reverse engineer, because the Chinese do that all the time.
Exactly.
I mean,
It's
I
not
can't
always
tell you how many
UAP
times
related. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times there was a story about the new Chinese fighter jet or missile, and Lockheed was like, Jesus Christ, they stole that from us. They stole the plans, or they, figured out the blueprints and did their own version of it. I mean, so that happens all the time, economic espionage and that sort of thing. But I think what Congress is talking about is not that. They're talking about something that fell in our laps or we were able to get hold of that seemed to exhibit some sort of technology that we didn't build and we don't think anybody else on this planet builds.
Right. And I think it's really important what you said about the whistleblowers coming forward and their credibility, because just because you worked on a certain program or you worked on anything that's related or worked on the government that's related to the government, it doesn't mean that you might be telling the truth. It has to be weeded out. I agree, because there's a lot of people that tell a lot of false narratives, even though they might have worked on a government facility. It doesn't make them always the most credible and reliable. I'm really happy you said that, because I'm curious to see what's going to come forward. I'm curious to see what Sean Kirkpatrick now is going to let forward after the 72 hours, because here's the thing is we don't know what activates that 72 hours, because we know that moving forward that Congress Sean Kirkpatrick and people have been briefed about what's going on. There's been a large amount of them. I think about 11 of them to date so far, and probably more that I don't know of, but it hasn't activated the 72 hours that we know. So what activates that 72 hours, and then what pushes it into where then the Congress gets to know fully, and then along with that moves into the president knowing at the end? Because I believe from what I read through the legislation that the president will always know now at the end, and will be briefed on this, and will decide if it's classified or unclassified. And then if it's presented then maybe to the larger masses, I don't know what happens after that, but very, very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a big question mark how that process plays out in reality versus what the intention was for it. I mean, still a big question mark in all of this is, yes, we have Arrow. You have this sort of centralized point, which now apparently has its own budget, and at least rhetorically has been empowered by the powers that be, the Secretary of Defense, the Congress, to go out and do this job. But that doesn't mean that every little fiefdom within the Pentagon or within the intelligence community is actually going to share what they know. They're only going to be as effective as the system feeds them information. And that means the system feeds them what they already know, or the system actually goes out as intended and collects more information to send to them. Because, Sean Kirkpatrick doesn't have a big radar sitting in his office in the Pentagon. I mean, they're basically just an office. Yes, they have connections to all these other agencies and the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Army, presumably the Coast Guard, the FBI, the FAA. But,
they don't have some massive budget. They have no budget. Yeah.
Right. But and even if they had a massive budget, that helps because, money talks in Washington. Mm-hmm. If you have a real budget, people care. They listen to you. But even if they had a real budget, there's no guarantee that this balkanized map of bureaucracies in a very secret world of national security, which is designed to keep things, not to share them. After 9/11, we found out they weren't even sharing stuff with each other. They should have known, they should have been able to capture those 19 terrorists because they basically had all the information. But the FBI didn't give what they knew to the CIA and vice versa. And so to me, the big question is going to be whether Congress even gets a full story, because in the end, it's going to be dependent on what Arrow gets, how much cooperation they get. And cooperation, I asked Sean Kirkpatrick a version of this question, which was, are they getting cooperation? And his answer was, of course, yes. And from what I understand, there is this sort of body of people that works with Arrow or advises Arrow, and each member of that body represents a different agency within the government. But if I'm the CIA rep to Arrow, and the CIA is not telling me everything they know about this, I'm not very useful to Arrow, right? I mean, I'll tell them what I know. I'll tell them what they tell me I should know. But again, without really knowing the dynamics of that. And that's what Congress should be asking. I mean, and continuing to legislate on. If they don't feel like the system is really sort of elevating what's there to know, they need to keep at this, because, otherwise it's going to stay. Some things might stay below the radar, so to speak, and we'll never get to Sean Kirkpatrick in the first place. And the whole other separate issue is the collection issue. I'm one who believes they don't have as many secrets as people think they might have, and that's because they didn't want to collect this stuff, right? And so my question would also be, how much are they really going out there using those radars, collecting more data about UAP, and actually trying to figure out what they are?
I want to go back in time now to 2017, because we are talking about whistleblowers, and if they decide that they are whistleblowers or not. Christopher Mellon and Lou Elizondo had a story that they pitched to the New York Times and to yourself at Politico about the Pentagon UAP story. That was a massive story that ended up going on the New York Times and going viral and really bringing this conversation into mainstream. But a lot of people don't know that you were actually pitched this story under embargo too from Christopher Mellon and Lou Elizondo. Can you break down the mechanics on how that happened?
It was unusual, I should say, at first, in terms of just my own experience, in a number of ways. I mean, it was the summer, I guess, of 2017 that we were first approached, myself and a colleague at Politico, by Chris Mellon, who very clearly from the get-go was pretty open about the fact that he was in contact with, working with this person who was still in the government, who had the UAP portfolio, who was frustrated, didn't think people were taking this seriously enough, his higher ups, and was about to leave the government and wanted to go public. And it was clear that Chris and, I soon learned Lou Elizondo were shopping this story around. And so when they came to me, I was aware they were talking to other news outlets as well. And I think even early on, I may have known it was the New York Times and maybe the Washington Post, a few others. And it was clear to me that they felt like, well, we don't know who's going to bite on this. The mainstream media doesn't normally write about UFOs, right? So, they wanted to sort of, I think, maximize their options. And, I had dealt with sources before who said, hey, I want to work with you on a story. I think this is important. I think you guys want to cover it. It's newsworthy. But let's talk about the ground rules about what we share, under what condition, and when you can publish. And it was clear from the beginning that they were not ready to, quote unquote, give us the story, all of it. And I think that's because they were playing footsie with a couple of different publications, including us. And was it a perfect scenario for me? No, because it's like, either you're going to tell me or you're not. Like, what is this game? But it was enticing enough. I obviously had the ability to go around and ask questions to other people about this without revealing at the time my sources. And so we did that. And I brought in some other editors and reporters too, to sort of look over my shoulder to help me. It was later that year that I met both Mr. Mellon and Lou Elizondo in person a couple times, Lou especially, because, obviously he was the story, to be honest with you. I mean, if you didn't have a government official who recently departed and was going to go public on this and checked out in terms of what he was claiming his job was and what he was doing, I'm not sure it would have been a story. Might have been, but it would have been a different story for sure. And so I met with Lou to gauge his credibility. One of my editors also met with Lou and with Mellon. And to me, it very quickly became a story about Mr. Elizondo, but it also became a story about how Congress, and mostly then Senator Harry Reid, had kind of been the father of this very small research effort that had been created in the Pentagon back in 2007 called ATIP. I guess the precursor was called OSAP, which is a lot of debate over when OSAP began and ATIP took over, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think we can all generally agree that Harry Reid created this effort, which in part was to look into some really interesting unexplained events that seemed pretty credible. And so for me, it was also a politics story. It wasn't, we were Politico. So it wasn't just guy comes out, says, hey, I ran the UFO operation, and man, nobody cares about all these crazy things we saw or found or investigated. And I'm so frustrated that I think we need public attention on this. You also now had a leading senator who was not in office in 2017, but had been also the Senate Majority Leader, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, who was, had paternity over all of this. So that became part of the story as well. And then, to make a long story short, I started doing more reporting, building out the story. But at that point, Lou was not ready to go public. He was, still deciding the when, the how, et cetera. And then, it must have been October, November 2017, where both he and Mr. Mellon just kind of went dark on me. And I took that as a sign they must have decided the New York Times or someone else was a better bet. And obviously the New York Times readership is bigger than Politico's. So, maybe that was the calculation. And so I basically prepared my story because I knew that at some point this was going to drop. And so my story was done. It was ready. It was written. I just didn't have permission from Lou and Chris to run with it yet. And they were key sources on the story. And so when the New York Times, boom, published that on a Sunday morning in December of 2017, we were ready to go. I called Chris, I called Lou, and I said, I don't know where you've been the last couple of months, but I figured you decided to go with the New York Times. We're going to run our story. And Lou gave me a fresh quote, and we ran our story. But so that's how it happened. We were both sort of reporting it in tandem. And just because of the way they were orchestrating this, very public media campaign. I mean, that's what Elizondo and Chris Mellon were doing. They wanted to get this out there, that there was a Pentagon office. The guy who ran it, was throwing up his hands. We need more attention on this problem set of UAP. And so that's how it happened. So our stories ran the same day. I think, their story ran maybe a half hour before ours went live, but we were ready to go.
Amazing. Why did you ask Christopher Mellon if that footage that he showed you, and I would imagine you did see the footage. I should ask you that if you saw it in advance.
He didn't give it to me, but I remember distinctly sitting in an undisclosed location with Lou, and he showed it to me on his iPad.
So you saw it before it went live.
It also showed me, I should mention this, also showed me, because I asked for it,
right,
the documentation that showed that he had gotten it declassified. Because that was also,
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah. Are you showing me something that's secret?
I was just going to ask, or they're not legal. Yeah.
Right. And that also, quite frankly, enhanced his credibility. I mean, and obviously I didn't just take his word for it when he showed me the documents that showed that they had been declassified, because that, you could doctor those. But was able to sort of
check that. How do you fact check any of that stuff?
In that case, I'm not going to say who, but you find someone as a source who works in that world of declassification. So has done this, has reviewed things like this and said, yes, that can be released for public consumption.
But it could have been someone like Susan Goff, because she's obviously, it wouldn't be anybody like that. They are not the most friendly as Susan Goff and Lou Elizondo. So it wouldn't be a spokesperson.
I don't think Susan Goff was working this issue then. I mean,
that's a good point. Yeah.
Christopher McDermott was a spokesman at the time who I think was handling requests, and I get a very strong sense, whether it's Susan Goff or Christopher McDermott or any of these other career spokespeople at the Pentagon, nobody wants to be the UFO spokesperson. I mean, there's no winning. There's, you're never going to please everybody. And so I'd give them credit for even doing it because, if it were me, I'd be like, send me to the North Pole to be the spokesman there. I would, it might be better for your health and your professional well-being than having to handle this portfolio.
Was that Politico's first UAP story too?
I mean, certainly while I was there, I don't think we ever covered. I mean, I got to Politico in 2015. Before that, I was the Pentagon reporter for the Boston Globe for 14 years. And so I don't think Politico wrote about it before, but, it doesn't mean there wasn't something here or there. I had covered the Pentagon for all those years and I'd never written about it either. I mean, I once assigned a story about UFOs, though. I do remember that. I had an intern one summer, I guess, at the Boston Globe, and it was around maybe 2011 or 2012. But if you remember, I don't know if you remember, you're probably, it's a while ago, but somebody, and I think it's become yet another controversy in UFO world, but somebody had digitized all the Project Blue Book files. And so you could search it online for the first time. And I don't even know how I found out about it. Somebody mentioned it. I was like, oh, that's fun. I was aware of Blue Book and sort of the lore and the mystery surrounding that 20-year, whitewash, effectively, is what I think a lot of people would agree, that they were looking into UFOs, but they sort of had a mission going into it of what we're going to find or not reveal. But the intern, I said, hey, fun little story for Sunday's Boston Globe might be to search for the most interesting, fantastical cases in New England that were reported or studied by Blue Book. And I remember one of my colleagues, he's now a very accomplished reporter, Sylvan Lane, who I thought had the best journalism name in history. I'm name calling him now, but Sylvan wrote a great story it was sort of a feature story about, hey, remember way back when the government studied UFOs? Well, here's some really cool things that they were scouring New England trying to find answers to. But that was literally the only time this subject ever came up, which is surprising, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. It is actually very surprising because a lot of outlets, like the New York Times, has been covering this for a very, very long time. Yeah, and a lot of outlets have been. Yeah, they just don't say it publicly.
I think it just demonstrates that, at least in the modern era, this was not a subject that a lot of people in the mainstream media, or in my view, in the government, cared much about. I mean, you can look it up. The current sitting Secretary of the Air Force, I asked him this about a year or two ago on the record in a press conference. And he said, listen, I spent my whole life protecting America. He's 73, 4 years old, Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force. And criticize him or not criticize him, his answer to me was, listen, these reports have been made for generations. They've never attacked us that I know. They've never really been threatening that I know. And he's like, my job is to protect us against threats that we know. And there's a lot of threats here on Earth that I got to worry about. Now, if someday that changes, then obviously my point of view would change. And, he's been criticized for saying that because people say, well, where's the Air Force in all of this? It's the Navy pilots that came forward. Does the Air Force not know anything about the phenomena? But I think it gets to this culture that here you have a national security practitioner who spent 50 years in very senior positions in the defense industry, in government, going back to at least the 70s. He's like, not a big deal. Like, yeah, there's stuff out there all the time. We don't know what it is, but I don't know that it's a pressing, priority for us. And I think there is that mindset still. People don't want to go there because unless it's dropping a bomb on us or, is directly threatening in a way that can't be denied, what are we going to do? Are we going to solve what nobody else has been able to solve for all these years and decades? I think that mindset is still there even now.
It's unfortunate. And hopefully people open their minds a little bit more. And also, outside of just looking at UAPs as being something that's like extraterrestrial or interdimensional, we do have to be mindful that they are just unidentified flying objects. And sometimes those things can be threats, and they are things from foreign adversaries and things that we have to be really mindful of. And you are working now with Ryan Graves with Americans for Safe Aerospace, I believe. Can you tell me a little bit about that before we close out the show? Just because I think it's a great concept from what I've heard, and Ryan Graves is doing some amazing things, and I'm just happy to hear that you're involved in it as well.
Yeah, well, I'm honored to be part of it. I mean, I'm just sort of advising a little bit. I give Ryan a lot of credit. I mean, he's a former F-18 pilot who has had and been, in uniform where there were some very inexplicable occurrences that clearly jarred him. And what Americans for Safe Aerospace is trying to be is sort of a very nonpartisan, non-ideological advocacy group that focuses on what I think everyone can agree on, no matter what your point of view is about the origins of the unknown, whether they're from here, from there, or somewhere in between, which is if there's something up there and we don't, or below the sea, and we don't know what it is and whose it is, and it's operating near what I think we also would agree are often very sensitive locations or over very sensitive locations, military bases, nuclear sites, which again is based on at least some of the reporting. That's where a lot of these are being seen. Why would we want to not know what they are and who they are? And it gets back to what I said earlier about the Air Force Secretary's comments. I mean, I think where his argument falls apart, quite frankly, is in the intelligence business, it's not just capability that you assess of your enemy, it's intent. And if you don't know the intent, you almost have to assume that it's possible they have ill intent, or they're gathering information to then give to someone else that could be used for ill intent. I mean, if you and I flew a drone over a nuclear base, I mean, we'd be in jail within 72 hours would be a lot. It'd be 72 seconds, right? And so Americans for Safe Aerospace wants to push an agenda where it's Congress, the executive branch, academia, the scientific community, engineers. We need to build a coalition that demands that our government stop ignoring, or if they're not giving enough attention to, this issue of our own aerospace over our sovereign territory that's being violated. Now, maybe it's being violated for not very, nefarious reasons, but what if it is? And so that's really what it's focused on. No matter what you think they are, who they belong to, it's our responsibility and our government's responsibility to do a better job of figuring out what's up there, especially, as I said earlier, in an era where there's lots of stuff up there, just because technology has advanced so much and drones and everything else have advanced. So that's really what we're focused on. And we're just getting started. Ryan is leading this. And the one last point I'll make on this, which is, we sit around and understandably talk a lot about what does the government know? What are they going to tell us? What are they going to share? Are they going to, reveal more? I think we need to keep that pressure on. But I also think if that's where we focus our efforts only, we're going to be disappointed, because if they know more, they won't want to share it for national security reasons or other reasons, theological reasons, religious reasons, whatever. Or they don't really know all that much. They know some interesting things, but they're puzzle pieces and they're very intriguing, but they haven't put it together. So they don't really even know what to tell us. But if we're going to count on that to get the answers, I think we're missing the boat. I mentioned that you and I could go buy a drone on Amazon and, go fly it. We live in an era now where technology is so commercialized and so available to citizens that if we want to find more answers, I think we need to find them. We, the people, need to find them too. And not just be waiting for the CIA to someday tell us what they know. I mean, I just think betting on that is not a very good bet. And I'm not saying it's easy. We don't have big radars. We don't have big surveillance planes or Navy ships all over the place or satellites in orbit. But We could. If you built a coalition, we could pull together the money and build a satellite to look for this stuff, right? I think that's where the answers could come. Scientists, academics, people outside the government, working with the government, but also working on their own.
I 100% agree. I think it takes advocacy from all different areas, from science, technology, and from the average person, because that's where we're at now. We have that ability. So why not use our voice and be able to have a louder voice and obviously make change? So I fully agree. And I'm happy to see you guys are doing that. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me. And as I said to all my guests, thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me.
Thanks for having me.